Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. For more than 60 years, the U.S.-Japan relationship has served as the cornerstone of stability in the Indo-Pacific. The alliance has evolved into a relationship of shared values, deep economic ties, and a robust military partnership. And in recent years, the relationship seems to be growing even stronger in some ways. So China's rise has brought the US and Japan into closer alignment on China strategies. Japan is transforming its security posture, making it a more active partner for the US in advancing both regional and global security. And we're also seeing different kinds of diplomatic engagement, as well as bilateral relations, various networking and minilateral formats, the 2+2, the formation of the Quad with India and Australia, and then the trilateral summit with South Korea and the US as well. And at the start of the Trump presidency, things seem to be going really well for Japan. Prime Minister Ishiba was one of the first world leaders to visit President Trump, and the summit went well, at least a lot better than with Zelensky. But now there are some signs that things could be going awry. We've had some really difficult trade negotiations. The Trump administration has called for Japan to raise defense spending up to 3.5% of GDP. This prompted Japan to cancel some high-level meetings with US officials. And then Prime Minister Ishiba is in a difficult domestic position, having lost control of both houses of the Japanese parliament. So the question that we are here to answer today is, are US-Japan relations at a turning point? Are there fundamental shifts underway that are moving the foundations of this alliance? Or are the foundations pretty stable? And are they strong enough to endure any turbulence that we've seen over the last few months? So we are joined today by CSIS's two leading Japan experts. Dr. Kristi Govella is Senior Advisor and our Japan Chair. And Kristi, I think you might have a record for having returned from the country that we're talking about most recently. Were you in Japan, 48 hours ago?
About 36 hours ago. It depends on when you count departure time.
Okay.
Yes, I just got back.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And then Nick Szechenyi is the Vice President of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and also a Senior Fellow in the Japan Chair. Nick, I think your insights are not nearly as fresh. You were in Japan, 2 weeks ago?
Mid-July. Seems like eons ago, but yeah.
But I have a reason to be especially thankful to you, Nick, because you are very good at bringing back amazing flavors of Kit Kats after your trips. The first one this year was tea time, which I think spoke to my culture, my own culture. The second one was, not sure if it's appropriate for the workplace, sake. Trying to get me tipsy through sake-flavored Kit Kats.
You need a happy hour Kit Kat.
So thank you for providing these very strange flavors of candy. But I probably should move on to actually talking about Japan. So I'd love to start by setting the scene. And if we're going to understand if the fundamentals of the US-Japan relationship are changing, then it's probably helpful to talk about what are those fundamentals. And so, looking back at the sort of past decade or so, or in general, maybe Kristi, if we can start with you, kind of what are the fundamental pieces of the US-Japan relationship? What are we talking about here?
Well, I think you covered it pretty well in your intro, but as you say, the U.S.-Japan alliance is really considered to be the cornerstone of peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. So you have a strong military partnership. You also have a very strong economic partnership, and strong ties between the two countries that really go from top leadership all the way down to the grassroots of society. So, the U.S. and Japan share a lot of common interests as well as values. They also are concerned about the same kinds of threats in the region when they think about China, North Korea, increasingly Russia. So really, this partnership is at the heart of regional geopolitics and also at the heart of a lot of what at least the previous administration was trying to do in networking allies and partners globally.
And if we do look back a bit, from my impression at least, it seems the relationship that the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had with Donald Trump during his first term was a really good relationship. They got on very well. Kind of, Nick, I understand you maybe are a fan of Abe and his approach. Why was he successful? How did he manage to forge this relationship with President Trump?
Sure. Multiple factors. I think one, he got in early. He saw the president-elect soon after the election, established a personal relationship. He played golf. That helped. So there was a lot of golf diplomacy. But I think fundamentally, Abe benefited from two things. Number one, political stability in Japan. He was established as Japan's leader and Japan's voice internationally. And he articulated basically a global leadership strategy for Japan, which was strengthening Japan's defense capabilities, becoming even closer to the U.S., and partnering with other like-minded countries in Asia and around the world. And so when he first met Trump, he really was uniquely situated to talk to Trump about Asia as a region, about Japan's plans to manage stability, prosperity in Asia, and how the U.S.-Japan relationship fit in. So there was a lot of rapport between the two of them, but it was really Abe's confidence and his strategy that I think had an impact during Trump's first term.
And please correct me if I'm wrong, but both Prime Minister Abe and now Prime Minister Ishiba are from the Liberal Democrat Party. Is that right? And confusingly, in the UK, the Liberal Democrats are quite a left-wing party, but in Japan, they're the more conservative party, or at least to the right of the spectrum. Is that right? So maybe, was there some kind of ideological alignment there that was helping, do you think?
Well, you're right, Will. Japan has a very particular and unique political context in the sense that for most of the last 70 years, it's been ruled by a single party, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a really wide, contains a wide spectrum of viewpoints ranging from fairly progressive to fairly conservative. So in that sense, between Abe and Trump, I think there were certain kinds of resonances and certain kinds of compatibilities with their viewpoints. But, depending on which leader is at the head of the LDP, that can vary. And so Ishiba is of a generally more centrist, or some would say liberal, part of the Liberal Democratic Party, although maybe not so much so as other progressives from other countries might seem. So so the Japanese context can be a little bit more difficult to decipher sometimes.
Okay. So keeping with Prime Minister Ishiba, so when President Trump came into office, when he won, election, what do you think were Ishiba's priorities to get out of this new relationship that he was forging with President Trump? Because they didn't really have a history together. Is that right? Yeah.
That's true. And because former Prime Minister Abe was tragically assassinated, they really didn't have someone to come into the White House and establish or reestablish that personal connection. So the Japanese government very adeptly, in my view, got in early. Ishiba met with Trump at the White House in early February of this year for a summit meeting. And two things struck me. I'd welcome, Kristi, your perspectives on that encounter. But they issued a very brief joint statement, which basically reiterated the three pillars we've already established about the fundamentals of U.S.-Japan relations: defense cooperation, economic partnership, and working with other countries on the future of the Indo-Pacific. So that was encouraging. And then in the press conference that two of them held, President Trump was very respectful, basically acknowledged that he thought Prime Minister Ishiba was a strong leader, and very positive about the relationship, which was striking because historically Trump was very critical of Japan, primarily with regard to trade imbalances, which I suspect we'll get to in a second.
Yes.
So that was very striking. And so sitting here in Washington watching that event, you might have assumed that, wow, this is going to be a continuation of a long pattern of momentum building in U.S.-Japan relations. But a lot has transpired since then.
And you just said that President Trump described Prime Minister Ishiba as a strong leader, but maybe that was the case, but now he's looking like a weakened leader, correct? After some of the results of the elections, most recently losing the majority in the upper house. So Kristi, can you help us understand a bit the sort of domestic politics piece here, and then how that shapes what Ishiba can do out of the U.S. relationship?
Well, Prime Minister Ishiba has actually had kind of a difficult run since he came to office last fall. He came to office, he called a snap election for the lower house. Then his party lost their majority in that house. And then, as you just said, they've lost their majority in the upper house. So this is the first time in the last 70 years that the LDP has been in the minority in both houses. And Ishiba has been the one to oversee that process. He's also been encountering a lot of challenges, as we've just been alluding to, externally in terms of U.S. pressure on trade, et cetera. So he's facing a lot of challenges from within his own party, from the increasingly strong opposition, and also externally. So yes, it's been a very difficult time. And so a lot of people are expecting that we might see a change in leadership, but he has been quite adamant that he would like to stay on at least a little while longer.
How is that strong opposition manifesting? Is it, are parties able to really block him from some of the initiatives that he'd like to be doing? Or is it more just a sense that he's more nervous now in this new political environment and doesn't want to take steps that are too bold that might make him lose even more support?
So in the Japanese context, it's actually a bit more complicated than a strong opposition, because the opposition has gained seats, but it's actually very fragmented, and the opposition parties are incredibly diverse. So some are ultra-conservative and some are rather progressive, and a number don't have particularly strong views on foreign policy, at least. So in terms of what that means for Ishiba, it makes the policy process more difficult, particularly if he needs budget approval to do things. It makes it more difficult to... he doesn't have a lot of political capital to expend, basically, right? So if he's trying to do things like justify defense spending, for instance, people want in Japan to see domestic issues, particularly economic issues, addressed. So the big issue of the election was really the state of the economy in Japan, inflation, rising prices, particularly for rice and other staples. And so we can see the election that happened on July 20 as a kind of referendum on the national economy primarily, although one narrative that's been getting a lot of attention is that immigration also came up on these kinds of stronger stances on foreigners. So basically, to answer your question, Ishiba, he has to wrangle more actors from inside and outside his party, and there are a larger number of issues on the table that are taking attention from those that he might want to focus on. So things are a lot more fluid and a lot more messy in Japan right now.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Kristi mentioned that the opposition is fractured. I think inside the Liberal Democratic Party, there's also a bit of a civil war going on. So Abe was a representative of the conservative wing of the party. Last year, there was a huge fundraising scandal that damaged the reputation of the LDP, primarily politicians who represented the conservative wing. And so they're trying to get their power back. Ishiba's trying to survive. And then you have opposition parties chomping at the bit, trying to engage the public. So it's a very fluid dynamic. I would just say one quick thing on the election. The LDP, as Kristi mentioned, has a long history of leadership. They're experienced. They know how to govern. The opposition parties don't have that experience, but what they figured out is how to talk to the public, primarily through social media. So there was this conservative party called Sanseito, which became very popular. And instead of talking about economic strategy or inflation, they changed the subject. They said, well, there's too much immigration. Let's blame the foreigners for our problems. And they came up with a moniker, Japanese first. And that really animated the public. And they used social media to develop that narrative. So we're in a situation right now where everyone's trying to position themselves for power. And the LDP, although I still think fundamentally is strong and has the capability to seize control of the narrative domestically, is really having trouble communicating with the public. And I think Ishiba is suffering a little bit from that.
So I was hearing several interesting echoes there, maybe to the domestic US political system here and what's transpired over the past few years. So maybe this is a bit of a segue into then the role that President Trump has played. And I think both of you have already talked about tariffs. So I would love to understand a bit more, how did the tariff discussion and negotiations play out in Japan? How did Japanese people in general feel about the threat that the Trump administration made to increase tariffs on Japan, but then also I think some of it played into what you were talking about, maybe with the rice. Am I right in thinking that rice was one piece of this discussion? So, Kristi, you were just there. What was the vibe you were hearing about the tariffs and then ultimately the trade deal that was signed?
Well, unsurprisingly, in Japan, like everywhere else, tariffs have basically dominated the discussion for the last several months. So they've received a lot of attention alongside the fact, as I was mentioning, that Japan has been facing inflation. And you have to remember that Japan hasn't had inflation in several decades. So they're seeing prices go up for the first time in some people's whole lifetimes, right? So this has been a very challenging situation. And it was a source of a lot of media attention. And people were really wondering if Ishiba was going to get a deal, if it was going to be a good deal before the election. So they have the election, the LDP loses their majority, and then they announce very shortly after that they've come to a deal. And so the initial reaction from the public was actually, I would say, pretty positive in the sense that they saw the specter of 25% reciprocal tariffs and high auto tariffs, et cetera, coming towards them on this August 1 deadline. And then they received a lower rate of 15% reciprocal tariffs, and most importantly, perhaps for some, the 15% auto tariffs. So autos are incredibly important to the Japanese economy. I think by some estimates, they employ about 10% of the Japanese workforce in various ways. So that was a huge deal. So I think people in Japan were relieved, but actually since that time, I would say that sense of relief has perhaps become a little bit more troubled as we have seen questions about the details of the deal, increased worries that the Trump administration might renege or go back if Japan doesn't follow its promises. And of course, at this moment, at least, President Trump has not clarified some details about the auto tariffs. So, I think that that moment of relief is becoming a little bit more cloudy. But in general, everyone is happy that they didn't face what seemed to be a much worse alternative that was coming at them.
But was there a sense of kind of shock that an ally would, threaten economic pain on Japan? Like, has that sort of fundamentally changed how the Japanese public views the US and like what this relationship with the US looks like? Or was that not the case where did they think, okay, that's kind of fair or to be expected? It's not just aimed at us, it's everyone across the world, including islands that have penguins on them. So I don't know, how is it easy to tell how the bigger picture of how the Japanese public viewed these negotiations and then the deal that was signed? I
mean, I welcome Nick's perspective on this too, but I think it wasn't a surprise to the Japanese people. I think they knew it was coming. I think like most other people around the world, they were perhaps surprised at the degree to which the tariffs came with this administration. But, Japan is no stranger to U.S. pressure. This has been the story of a lot of U.S.-Japan relations. So I think for many, it brings back memories of, the U.S.-Japan trade wars in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. And for others, it may be the first time that they're seeing it this blatantly again in their lifetimes. But I think it wasn't so surprising, except perhaps in the tone and the severity.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, what I heard was not so much that the tariff rates themselves were shocking, because you had to predict that this was coming from the second Trump administration. What I have heard, though, is just kind of disappointment that the United States is just no longer in the traditional trade liberalization game. And we can go back 10 years when the Obama administration did not move to ratify TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, a very comprehensive trade agreement in the region. President Trump in his first term withdrew entirely from that agreement. And Japan and other countries in Asia ever since have been left to kind of focus on and lead the dialogue in the region about economic norms and the benefits of trade, at the same time as the country on which Japan fundamentally depends for its national security is drifting and no longer involved in that strategic dimension of economic policy. So yes, the tariffs hurt, and it's a signal of transactional diplomacy that friends in Japan don't like. But I think fundamentally, it's also a sense of disappointment that the U.S. is fading from its traditional leadership role as a norm maker, as a rule maker in Asia. And that pain, I think, is going to be felt for quite some time.
And for Japan, those rules and norms of the international order are very important. They see those as key to their national interests, as key to, maintaining their prosperity through trade, as key to security and preventing, countries from invading other countries all willy-nilly. So I think that, a lot of countries talk about that, but Japan really has internalized the importance of those international rules and norms. So it's particularly disappointing on that score.
So helpful segue then to the security piece here. And the pressure has been building on Japan to increase the percentage of its budget that is spent on defense spending. And I know this has been a long-term development that Japan is spending more there. But now with this request from the demand, I don't know, from the U.S. government to for Japan to increase it to 3.5% of GDP. Is this again something that Japan feels is kind of to be expected? They're used to U.S. pressure to increase defense spending, or is there any risk that this really creates a backlash in Japan, and sort of undermines this security relationship that exists between the two countries?
I think it's perfectly legitimate for the United States to ask its allies to invest more in defense and develop more sophisticated capabilities as the international security environment becomes so severe. The history of the U.S. Japan alliance is about the United States encouraging Japan to incrementally expand its ambitions and its capabilities in the defense realm. And so that's not entirely new. But that was always done in the context of how strong alliance relationships are in the interests of the United States. And that piece of the narrative right now is missing. So from my vantage point, you have a U.S. government that's pressing allies to spend more on defense. The narrative is about burden sharing. But what the narrative should be about is how close alliance relationships strengthen deterrence, and not only strengthen the capabilities of our allies, but support the interests of the United States. And so the fundamentals are not that different, but the narrative and the tone is different. So I am speculating here, but now that we're more or less done with tariff negotiations, I think people will wonder if the next one is going to be defense spending, and are we going to see a similar sort of tense environment? And so that's an uncertainty we'll just have to navigate.
I agree with that. I think that everybody expects that discussions on defense burden sharing are going to be next on the agenda. I would just make a couple of additional points. One is that I think that, of course, as you were alluding to, economics and security are really intertwined here. So, it is difficult to ask an ally to spend more on defense when you're also asking them to do more on economics or imposing tariffs that are going to weaken their economy. So, if the Japanese economy is shrinking, there's less money to spend on things. There are more trade-offs. They also have an aging population that is going to have a lot of demands for healthcare and pensions, et cetera. So it makes it harder, to make those kinds of increases. And the second point would just be that, again, as you alluded to, Japan has already been taking pretty historic steps to increase their defense spending beyond what they have been doing. So I think that many in Japan are hoping that there will be at least some credit for, the steps that have already been taken. And with the knowledge that more will be demanded, that there will be some kind of recognition of that. But that remains to be seen.
So the impression I'm getting from both of you is that the answer to the question I posed at the start is no. That U.S.-Japan relations are not really at a turning point, that the fundamentals of them are kind of holding true, even if there is more pressure, and that there are challenges associated with pressuring the different pieces of the relationship all at the same time. But does that sound right to you?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the joint statement from the February Trump-Ishiba summit, you would come away very encouraged that the fundamentals are there. But right now, the primary narrative is about friction. And my main concern is that when the U.S. and Japan are just talking about their differences, China wins. Because China's goal strategically is to drive a wedge between the U.S. and its allies and to weaken the U.S. alliance network in Asia. So if the U.S. and Japan are fighting about tariff lines, we're not talking about how strengthening our alliance benefits regional stability. and China senses weakness, China's going to exploit that in some kind of way. And that's why I'm harping on this larger framework for the alliance relationship. We have to get back to explaining the rationale for this robust alliance. And if we don't, I think that's not going to benefit the U.S. or Japan in a very competitive space in Asia.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think we're at a turning point yet because there's a lot of structural factors that really keep the U.S. and Japan quite close. They have a lot of shared interests that even from a transactional perspective are really hard to deny, I would say. So I think that at the moment, we're seeing questions, we're seeing uncertainty, but it's far too early to say there's a turning point. And I think domestically, too, I think there are some people who are kind of jumping to the conclusion that the emergence of this Sanseitou party and the Japanese first slogan rearing its head in Japan means that Japan is going to be heading in a U.S.-like direction of populism. And I also think that's too soon to say. But things are getting more fluid on both the domestic and the foreign policy fronts. So it'll be an area to watch.
Great, thank you. We might be accused of having clickbaity titles then, because I think so far the answer to most of them has been no. Maybe next week we'll have to have someone on who will say yes. But thank you. That's really, really helpful and a really important context that I think has been missing as someone who doesn't follow Japan as closely. So I want to conclude then with our 3 questions, quick fire round. So firstly, can you sum up US-Japan relations and the state of them today in one word?
I would say coping, making the best of a bad situation.
Okay, coping.
Forgive the automobile metaphor, given the tariff discussions, but I would say idling. The engine's running. We're doing a lot diplomatically. We're doing military exercises. Again, the foundation is there. We just need to put our foot on the gas pedal and accelerate. And it's not quite clear how or when that's going to happen.
Okay, great. So then as it relates to Japan, who is up, who is down the most this week between China, Russia, and the US? Who's had a good week?
I would probably say it's the U.S., actually. I think because I would say things were far down when the threat of tariffs was oncoming. And so I think there's still an important rebound, an important sense that, a hurdle has perhaps been passed. I think Russia's never up with Japan these days since the invasion of Ukraine, and not China particularly. What do you think, Nick?
I'll say China, because if you sense political instability in Japan and some friction between the United States and Japan, you might think there's a window to exploit that situation, especially in terms of propaganda. And so I think China is benefiting from this period of uncertainty in U.S.-Japan relations.
Okay. So now your ability to ban pundits, or at least us on the podcast, from using one term.
This was a tough one.
Oh, yeah? Okay. Well, what did you come up with, Nick?
I'm going to say kabuki. I'm just not a fan of theater metaphors, but that's just me.
Yeah.
For me, it's crisis. I think that we've been hearing that word a lot lately, and there's a time to use it, but I don't think it's right now, at least not with U.S.-Japan.
Okay, great. I think you have both explained that the fundamentals of the U.S.-Japan partnership remain. The shared interests are still there, and they're kind of built in. There are sort of structural things that are holding them together. But this narrative of friction really helps China and creates openings for China, whether it's to exploit, even just in terms of propaganda and messaging. And I think, Kristi, you said Japan is no stranger to U.S. pressure, but kind of disappointed with the way that the U.S. role is changing when it comes to trade liberalization. And then Nick, you saying that perhaps just pressing allies on burden sharing without explaining the benefit of closer alliances for improving deterrence is kind of a missed opportunity there to explain the rationale behind all of this. But ultimately, doesn't seem like there's a crisis in U.S.-Japan relations. So I think you have reassured me somewhat, but you have also warned that, there are new signs of tensions to come, and we should watch out for that debate over the defense spending to come. And unfortunately for Prime Minister Ishiba, he doesn't have a great domestic situation, both within his own party and also with more vocal opposition. So it will be tricky for him to navigate these challenges ahead. Nick, I have something in front of me here. A Kit Kat.
You've earned a Kit Kat, Will. This was a fantastic conversation.
What is, I can't read it. What flavor?
It's Tokyo Shima Lemon. Very good for this time of year. Very refreshing.
Okay.
Nestle, if you're listening, I'm a big fan.
Okay, there's a sponsorship opportunity there, maybe. Kristi and Nick, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.